Good evening, everyone. Good to be here. Good to see everyone. We're going to continue our Wednesday night or Sunday night study the way we have been, kind of an open forum Bible class type. What we're going to be looking at this evening is the idea of pride. What pride can do to us, how as Christians we cannot be prideful. It's not the type of attitude or trait that we should be showing. Proverbs 16, verse 18. We're going to look at quite a few verses throughout this lesson that talk about this, but really Proverbs 16 and verse 18 probably sums up the message of what we're going to be talking about the most. And I know you've heard this proverb before, and it goes, "Pride goes before destruction, and a haughty spirit before a fall." You know, the very core trait to a child of God is one of humility. You may remember, if you want to turn over to Matthew chapter 20, starting in verse 20. I'm not going to read through this whole lesson, but if you want to have it there as a reference here. James and John, they were two apostles. They were brothers. They had a mother. How about, I shocked you guys, right? That's something you never would have thought I would have told you. They had a mother. And you know what? That mother was much like many other mothers in the fact that she wanted her children to succeed. She wanted her boys to be in the best place that they could be. I think the question might have possibly maybe been out of place to even be asking. But I really do think, I don't think she was going up to Jesus thinking that, the rest of the other apostles are all trash and only my son should be on the right and the left side. Places of honor is what he's saying. And now Jesus, he tells him, he says, first of all, it's not my place. It's the Father's place, to place that type of a thing. But this is a different type of pride. A lot of times when we talk of pride, we talk about personal pride usually, right? We can be overly proud, even about our children, can't we? To the point where maybe we're even blind about certain things, and maybe we don't see. I see, it never happened, right? There's never was ever a teacher that ever called my parents when I was in school, okay? But, yes, it happened a couple of times. I was fearful every time it happened. But then you hear these stories today of parents going in and yelling at a teacher because the teacher was disciplining the child who was out of control. I see Erica shaking her head back there. She must have experienced some of this before. And that right there, is that not pride in your children too much? Should we be proud of our children? Yes, we should have proud feelings about our children. We should want to even promote our children to do well, right? But we can't be blinded to who they are to the point where we don't listen to anybody else. And I see those types of things happening. And, you could look at the mother of the sons of Zebedee, as it says there in the text, and you could say, oh, I can't believe she did that. But you know what? I really think there's probably a lot of other mothers out there that would have been doing the same thing. And I don't think, like I said, I don't know. I'm just reading what I see here. But I think she was just being a mother. She was looking out for her children. Now, maybe I'm looking into this wrong, and we could look into it and say, oh, that horrible woman, why would she do that? But I don't look at it that way. I think Jesus looked at it as a learning moment anyways. If you've ever said anything wrong, but said it to the right person, they handle it better, if you know what I mean. Like Jesus could have yelled at her and said, that's not the right way to act. The kingdom of God is not about people being elevated. Well, that's not what he did. He didn't beat her down. He just let her know, first off, it's not my place to do that. But then second of all, he goes on, let's see, I'm going to Yeah, let's go verse 24 of 20. And when the 10 heard it, they were greatly displeased with the two brothers. But Jesus called them to himself and said, you know that the rulers... Excuse me. You know, the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and those who are great exercise authority over them. Yet it shall not be so among you. But whoever desires to become a great among you, let him be your servant. And whoever desires to be first among you, let him be your slave. Just as the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. So here we have this scene here, and you know, it says the other 10 were a little bit perturbed, weren't they? They were a little bit taken aback by what was just done. You know, and I can almost imagine even grown men looking at James and John and saying, oh, you need your mom to go talk for you, huh? You know, picking on each other a little bit. But what we get here is a teaching moment. You know, and Jesus says, hey, we're not like the Gentiles. You know, the Gentiles, they get into authority and they lord it over you. That's not what the kingdom of heaven is about. And then he concludes it really by the ultimate, which is, and even the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve. Cindy? Yeah. Yeah, you know, Mom, I'm an adult. You don't need to be fighting my battles for me. You know, and that kind of, and I like to look at the Bible like that, and you know, kind of analyze things and say, you know, human nature. What were maybe some thoughts that were going on, you know, and things such as that. But the key thing here is that when we're in the kingdom of heaven, it's not about me. It's about God. It's about serving God. Another time that happened here, Matthew 18, verses 1 through 4. And here is the apostles, or the disciples themselves, coming to Jesus. And at this time, the disciples came to Jesus saying, who then is greatest in the kingdom of heaven? Then Jesus called a little child to him, set him in the midst of them, and said, assuredly I say to you, unless you are converted and become as a little children, you will by no means enter the kingdom of heaven. Therefore, whoever humbles himself as a little child is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. Still got a little frog in my throat from being sick last week. It just wants to hang on. Sorry about the coughing. So here we have the disciples coming. And you know, they're coming. Who is going to be the greatest in the kingdom of God? Now, I want you to jump back to where we just were a minute ago with the sons of Zebedee's, their mother, and her, and Jesus' answer about the Gentiles. I want you to think about the idea, you know, none of us like to think about war or battles or fights or things such as that. But when someone is fighting a war that is legitimate, they're standing up, you know, for instance, in the Old Testament, anytime God told his people to go conquer a people, that was legitimate. God gave them the reason to do it. So what I'm saying is, you know, you see stuff like that. For instance, go back to the Revolutionary War. And I'll tell you what, you want to talk about a man that people tried to, in some aspects, in some ways, even deify. And it was George Washington. If you've ever heard the stories, I mean, there's stories of him coming off of the battlefield with literally bullet holes in his coat. Now, you know, what's the truth behind all those? I'm sure there's something to them, but, you know, it was more or less to build him up. But what I'm trying to get at is he was a hero for what he fought for. He fought for the right thing. And now the reason I'm bringing that up is we need to remember the place of the apostles at this point. They still think, even though they're traveling with the Messiah, they're still looking for a general, a king general to rise up and boot the Romans out. So you got to kind of think about their mindset here a little bit too, to understand where they're coming from. Because if you're in a battle, it's going to be very important to point to the leaders. What happens in war when a leader falls and there's not a good chain of recovery? You know, think back in the old, like back in the Dark Ages and stuff, when there was a king. Oftentimes, if the king was killed, guess what? The war might have been ended right then and there. It was done. That was the one person that needed to die. And what I'm trying to get at is just that mentality of where they're coming from. It's not the same, you know, I think if they understood the kingdom a little bit better, the way that we do now, and the way they eventually understood it, these questions probably wouldn't even have been asked. But they're still in that physical mindset. But either way, what matters to understand is what we need to understand about pride is it is destructive. Pride can come into a group of people and it can destroy them just because one person wants power or one person wants authority or one person wants, you know, and so that can happen. It's just a destructive force. You know, there are many in this world today that have allowed pride to hinder themselves from serving God. You know, we'll get into some questions later, you know, as far as what is pride and for us to really understand it. But we must deal with it if we are to become all that God wants us to be in His service. All right, so to just kind of a little bit more in this introduction here. I know I've been introducing this for 15 minutes, but bear with me. Sometimes we use the word pride in a positive sense. You can be prideful and not be sinning. Usually when you're feeling pride, it's in the right aspect, it's usually going towards somebody else. The pride that we're talking about is usually, look at how good I am. Look at what I can do. Look what I have accomplished. You know, that the pride we're talking is usually a self-centered pride. You know, like we talked about children earlier. Can we be proud of? Yes, we can be proud of our children, but that could also go too far. Chris? It is. Absolutely. It's really probably more of something that needs to be showed, you know, how it's done, rather than just saying you need to be this way and this way. It's something that I think we need to work for at times. I think as human beings, in a sense, we can look at ourselves in the mirror and say, I'm as a human being, I'm self-centered at times. So I need to prepare myself for that so that I'm not, so that I'm humble. And as Christy was saying, you know, it probably is a fine line there between, you know, pride and humility. And that's what hopefully we're going to figure out in this lesson here. To, number one, understand what pride really is. Number two, to realize how destructive it is and what it can do to an individual as well as a congregation. Eric? Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Even starting with Eve, if we could be like God.
Yeah.
Where you go to Aaron and Miriam, both brother and sister. They, at one point, kind of in a rebellious mood because they said, well, aren't we as good as Moses? Apparently not. That wasn't the way God reacted to that. King Saul, he had a little problem with admitting mistakes.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's still a problem today. You know, it's one of the three original. Eric had mentioned pride in the garden, pride of life, that wanting, that desire. You know, It's something God has warned us about from the beginning, that you have to be very careful. And hopefully that's what we're going to get to understand a little bit more. You know, we're going to look at a couple of different translations of the word as far as pride, maybe even looking in the Old Testament, at least the word haughty is used at many times. We'll look at a couple of those things. But if someone was going to ask you to define for them what pride is, what would you say? High opinion? Okay, sure, yeah. A high opinion, especially of, yourself. Yeah, absolutely. A high or inordinate opinion of one's own dignity, importance, merit, or superiority, whether as cherished in the mind or as displayed in bearing, conduct, etc. I kind of like that definition there, because it makes mention that pride is something that can happen up here just as well as being acted out. So it's our mind. We have to be very careful with how we use, the mind, the power that we have. What are some things, and Eric had just mentioned one of them, some things that cause us to have pride? One of those things is, I don't want to be wrong. I don't want to be wrong, so I'm going to stick to my guns no matter what and say I'm right. What are some other things that cause pride in people? Yeah, look at all that I have done. And the sad thing about him was he was even warned and given more time. Sure. Which is really sad, because then we tend to make ourselves look like bigger idiots because we get ourselves in trouble because we don't know what we're doing. But yeah, a lot of times we can be prideful because we're afraid to admit that we don't know how to do something. Yeah. We got also some people are just always on the defense and ready to argue because of pride. Not listening to others or taking input from others can cause us pride. We talked, why do we show pride off? Sometimes it's because we don't want to look bad. Sometimes it's because we don't want to admit we're wrong. Sad thing is there are people who are prideful about themselves to the point where they have convinced themselves that they're right, even when they're wrong. And that's when pride can really, really cause some destruction. All right. I just want to cover a couple of the words here from the Old Testament. We'll do that, and then we'll cover next week some of the words that we find in the New Testament, and then we'll look at some other examples and some things that take place in the Scriptures. First of all, the Strong's Word 1363. It is Gobahh. I don't even know how to pronounce that, and I thought 2 H's at the end. I'm going to have to look up and make sure that my notes are even correct, that that's even a word. It is. And it means exaltation, height, grandeur, haughtiness. One of the times that is used is in Psalms chapter 10 and verse 4. Another one that is used is Proverbs 16 and verse 18. Gaon, G-A, there's an apostrophe, O-W-N, and that one is for pride and arrogance. Really, there is... You could tell that this is a serious problem because of how many different words there are in the Hebrew language that can be translated over to be something similar, whether it's haughty or pride or something along that line. But literally there is, I don't know, there's like 10, I think there's 10 words just in the Old Testament that all, some of them are kind of looser as far as the translation, so you wouldn't use it as much, but I mean, it really is, to me, that tells me that there obviously is a concern here. It's a human problem, even though I know we can track it back to the Garden of Eden. Some of these other words here, Jeremiah 13, verse 17. Geva, or Giva, G-E-V-A-H, that is a pride or a lifting up. And just if you want to refer back to Jeremiah 13, 17 later on in your notes, I will tell you this. Read a couple verses before that, just so you can get the context of this particular verse here. And then, let's see, and then one more we want to cover here. Strong's Word 1344. And it's spelled G-E'-A-H, and that one's just simply pride. You can find that referenced in Proverbs 8 and verse 13. Why do we do this? Or why do we break down the words? Why, what is the importance of that? Because I'm not going to lie to you. I've had a few people say that part's really boring. And you know what? I'm not going to lie to you either. You're right. It can be boring sometimes. But it's necessary to understand, especially when we're talking about a book like the Bible, which has been translated into so many other languages. We got to make sure we understand what is being said. Now, hopefully next week we'll get into a little bit deeper discussion here into pride. But I want you to pray about this and think about this and really kind of look into that spiritual mirror that I mentioned at times and look at your own reflection and ask yourself. And you know what? Here's another one, and you might want to be careful with this one because you might not like the answer you get. You could ask your spouse if they think you have any tendency, because I'm not saying that to get yourself in trouble. I don't want to know what the answer is, so just go ahead and keep that to yourself. But what I'm trying to say is sometimes we can look at ourselves and say, oh, I'm okay. There's nothing else. I mean, we know that we can improve and we can get better in certain things, but there's not something that stands out. And I'll tell you what, I don't know. There's probably not anyone better than your spouse that can set you straight sometimes. You may not want to be set straight, but they're usually pretty good at it as far as hopefully putting you in the right track anyways. But pride is one of those things that I really think it can be something that affects somebody a little bit, and it can be something that affects and immerses their entire life. Now, I'm going to point out the one that's being affected by pride a little bit is probably the majority of us. There's going to be pride that's going to affect us in some way, shape, or form in this life. Maybe we've conquered some of those things and got past them. But the problem is when somebody is stuck in that prideful characteristic, that attitude. Can you even talk to someone who is like that? I mean, can you really even have a conversation? I'm not saying don't try to teach them, but what I'm saying is when someone has that mentality, when they're right, this is the way it is, it's hard to even talk to someone like that. And I think that's probably the reason why Jesus answered the two questions that we looked at before, the way he did. James and John, I don't ever want to see your mom again. Get her out of here. Can't believe she's asking questions like that. All right, I'm going to go get 12 more disciples because you guys are asking the same kind of questions, earlier than that. It's something it's something we need to be aware of, because pride is one of those things that literally can take you over and you don't even know it's there until it's pointed out sometimes because you get blinded to it. All right, anyone, questions, comments, anything? Right. Right. But look what I'm doing. Yeah. Yeah, there's no better example than the washing of the feet, I think, as far as talking about humility. So, anyone else? All right, well, we will offer the invitation here. And and we'll have our closing song here in a moment. But if there's anyone here that has any need, whether to be baptized into Christ or to rededicate your lives or prayer requests, we ask that you come forward as we stand and sing this song.